Linkin Park, a band that conjures up memories of everything 2000s, from AMVs to Transformers. They're considered to be one of the most commercially successful rock bands in the world, and it's hard not to see why. With their unique blend of genres like rap, electronica, alt rock, and heavy metal, Linkin Park's music showcased nu metal at its peak. And keep in mind, this was already a genre that was polarizing even at the height of its popularity. In fact, I feel like I'm insulting this band simply by roping them into the nu metal genre. I think what sets this band apart from their contemporaries at the time, like Limp Bizkit or Slipknot or Korn, was their versatility and sincerity. Linkin Park has explored so many genres over their 20+ year career. Dear God, I feel old just by saying that out loud. And then there's the chemistry between Mike Shinoda's tight raps and the angry, battle-hardened screams of the late Chester Bennington, which is regarded by many fans to be the band's bread and butter. With all that said, I freaking love this band, man. I was 13 when I got into these guys around the same time as Green Day, and because of that, I've always put these two together as the bands that truly got me into music. Anytime I do a video on Green Day, one in Linkin Park is sure to follow. As of this video's release, Linkin Park is in a different place right now. They also just released a new record with a new singer, which we'll dive deeper into later on. Which is why I think it makes sense that we take a look back at this band's discography, Gauntlet style. As always, I am not counting live albums, solo works, or remix albums. I also won't be covering the massive Linkin Park underground catalog, or else this video would be twice as long as The Brutalist. I'm only going to cover all 8 of their studio albums, from their debut to their most recent. Some will agree with my takes, others won't. But that's okay. These are all just my opinions, and I like a vast majority of these records. What can I say? This band's a guilty pleasure of mine. From the top to the bottom! Titled after the band's original moniker before they renamed themselves as Linkin Park, their seminal 2000 debut album Hybrid Theory had them hit the ground running. And the first 2 songs on this record don't just set the tone of this album perfectly, but also the band's sound for the rest of their career. Paper Cut has Mike Shinoda rapping about paranoia against these menacing, in-your-face riffs, blended together with Johan's turntable spins, and One Step Closer being the lead single off of this thing was just the perfect way to introduce this band to the world. I know people remember this album mostly from Crawling and In the End, but I do believe that this song deserves just as much praise. It makes you want to rebel against your parents for taking away your Game Boy Advance. As I was re-listening to this album for this video, I came to realize that Hybrid Theory deals with some heavy shit. Points of Authority is a song that deals with the aftermath of a toxic relationship. It's very reminiscent of Violator-era Depeche Mode, a band that Linkin Park has gone on record to call one of their biggest musical influences. The song By Myself deals with the pressures of fitting in with the rest of society and forcing yourself to wear a mask so that people would like you, all while developing these feelings of self-hatred and self-doubt in the process. And even Crawling deals with Chester's own experiences of addiction. You could feel the pain from his scream-like vocals, especially during the often memed chorus. If In the End didn't exist, this would probably be this album's biggest hit, even if it's already been mocked to oblivion. Speaking of which, In the End is an all-timer. I don't know what else I need to say here that everybody else hasn't already said yet, other than this song perfectly sums up the band's sound in a nutshell. Even its music video has become a staple of pop culture, influencing Half-Life 2 machinimas and Francis Ford Coppola movies for many more years to come. This band was ahead of their time. A Place for My Head and Forgotten are also badass. I love the latter song more simply because of its chorus. Mike and Chester's vocal chemistry is on full display on that one. There is also Cure for the Itch, which is this pretty cool interlude that showcases Johan's prowess as a DJ. I do have some gripes with this album though. I find With You to be lacking in lyrical substance, and even if it's lighter than other songs in this album thematically speaking, I just don't think the instrumentation and vocals really deliver on this introspection of a past relationship that it's trying to go for here. Runaway is kind of weak, with its only saving grace being Chester bringing in his A-game vocally, and Pushing Me Away isn't as good as Linkin Park's later album closers. I mean, the song isn't bad on its own, but in the greater context of everything that we've heard up until this point, it just doesn't really tie everything together all that well, personally. So, overall, this album's got bangers, but it isn't perfect. And I think its flaws kind of stop me from fully appreciating this record as well as your average Linkin Park fan. Which is why I see Hybrid Theory more like the musical equivalent of a popcorn movie. It's big, and it's really loud. But counterpoint, it's also way too damn fun not to enjoy. Just don't think about it too hard. I also don't normally talk about bonus tracks on this series, but My December and High Voltage are massively underrated. Those songs are nothing like anything off of the regular album, but they're great on their own. And it's worth getting the deluxe edition of this just for these songs alone. If you're not sold on Chester being a great singer and Mike being a great rapper, then these two songs would be very happy to prove you wrong. Linkin Park's 2003 sophomore album Meteora was one of my favorite albums when I was a kid. I previously went into great detail about my thoughts on this album, but long story short, 13-year-old me loved this album to death. I was the perfect demographic for this band. And in a time where most kids my age were listening to Ed Sheeran and Imagine Dragons, I was out here listening to Green Day and Linkin Park. I was a boy out of time, and I didn't care.
I'm so special, I'm the only one who listens to music not from this generation. Only 90s kids will remember this song.
But so much has changed over the years. When I first listened to that album, I had just finished 8th grade. Now, I'm a third-year comm arts undergraduate who's taking his thesis in a few months. Has my feelings on Meteora changed over the years? And my answer to that is, not really. This album still fucks. Probably because I haven't matured past the age of 15, but whatever. Meteora is Linkin Park at the height of their powers. This is an album they'll never top, no matter how hard they try. What's amazing about this record is that it basically takes everything great about Hybrid Theory and refines them to perfection. The riffs, the vocal performances, and hell, even the mixing are so much better here. Despite how brooding Somewhere I Belong sounds, it's actually a really uplifting song about finding your inner peace. Faint, Hit the Floor, and Figure Point 9 are great songs to sing at a carpool with the homies. From the Inside is also massively underrated. I'm kind of shocked this wasn't as big of a hit as the others. I also love how songs like Session give the other band members a chance to shine their musical abilities. In fact, this is the first Linkin Park album where they get to show that they are capable of more than just nu metal schlock. Breaking the Habit is an alt-rock tune that dives deeper on themes of self-hatred and addiction that was previously explored on their last record. They even revolutionized the AMV. Nobody's Listening shows that the band is truly passionate about hip-hop music, and that they really aren't just rapping over metal riffs just because Radham made it cool. Also, when I said earlier that Pushing Me Away was weaker compared to the band's other album closers, I truly meant it, because Numb outshines Pushing Me Away in every single way possible. It's one of the band's biggest hits, and it's hard not to see why. It's a very emotional ballad about failing to live up to societal expectations, and Chester's singing is what truly makes this song connect to so many people around the world, including myself. It's up there in my top 5 favorite Linkin Park songs, and it's also one of my favorite songs of the 2000s. Not gonna lie, it was genuinely really hard to find stuff on here that bothered me. I tried not to let my childhood nostalgia get the best of me, but man, it's just too fun to tear apart. It's all killer and no filler, and the weaker songs are still a lot of fun to listen to. Meteora has the sauce. There is one thing I dislike about this album though, and it's the AI music videos the band did for its 20th anniversary. Yet somehow, this isn't the most controversial thing the band's ever done. Fresh off the band's Fort Minor and Dead by Sunrise side projects, Linkin Park's third record, Minutes to Midnight, was a bit of a hard pill to swallow. In fact, their sudden shift to alt-rock would prove to be the first time the band and their fans didn't really see eye to eye with each other. Does this album deserve that 56 on Metacritic? Not exactly. In fact, I kind of like this record. The first half of it, at least. The band pulls off this authentic heavy metal sound very well on its first song, Given Up, with Chester's 17-second scream near the end being one of this album's highlights. And yes, it is in fact 17 seconds long. I timed it for myself. There's a bit of an emotional whiplash though, as it segues into the softer sounding pop rock of Leave Out All the Rest, as much as I vibe with that song just as much. I just wouldn't really put these two songs next to each other, you know? It just doesn't sit well with me to follow up one of the heaviest songs in the band's career with one of their poppiest. Lead It Out is a fun karaoke song, and how could I forget the musical embodiment of 2007? You know the one. Of course I'm talking about Big Girls Don't Cry by Fergie. Oh, and also that song for the first Transformers, I guess. This is a song that's so iconic, with many millennials and Gen Zers that grew up with the Bayformers, that it's turned into a meme song on par with All Star and Never Gonna Give You Up. Yeah, I said it. In fact, some of the softer material on here isn't all that bad. Hands Held High is a gospel-like solo rap number from Mike, where he laments the state of the Bush administration at the time of this album's release, although you could also apply that song with America's current state. Jesus Christ, good luck surviving those next 4 years, kids. I also think that the closing track, The Little Things Give You Away, is vastly underrated. It's politically charged, just like Hands Held High, except this one criticizes George Bush's handling of Hurricane Katrina.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
It's a haunting prog rock slow burner that culminates in this grand finale where Mike is quietly singing against Chester's cries of hopelessness and pain. It's a fantastic track that actually sets the stage for their next record perfectly. So, for the most part, the band's pulled off their first grown-up album pretty well. I say for the most part because, man, some tracks on here are just as colorless as the cover art. I actually liked Shadow of the Day when I first heard it as a kid, but it is really lifeless and drab in retrospect. That song feels like everybody was half asleep when they were recording that track. Brad Delson also sounds like he was phoning in that guitar solo near the end, which is kind of funny considering that his solo was the only memorable part of In Pieces. I think after Hands Held High, the album kind of loses its steam. Valentine's Day has some great vocals from Chester, but man, these lyrics are bad, even by this band's standards. And In Between sounds like an unfinished demo from Mike Shinoda's Fort Minor album. And even when the band gets heavy again for a brief moment on No More Sorrow, it just tries way too hard, proving to listeners that they can still make nu metal bangers, even though this is literally just a crappier version of a track you already heard on this album and enjoyed a lot more. I do like how stripped back this album sounds though. There's more songs where Chester gets to show off his vocal prowess, and I like how they're a lot more guitar heavy compared to their previous records. Poor Mr. Hahn gets nothing to do though. I guess to sum up my thoughts on this record in a nutshell, it starts out stronger than it finishes. Which is a bit of a shame because I do think this album is better than a lot of people give it credit for. I think when the band gets a little too soft at times, it really kills the momentum. If the softer songs on this album had a little more energy or passion like Leave Out All the Rest, then I think this would be a much more enjoyable listen. It did give us one of the best songs of the late 2000s after all. In fact, I actually have a funny story I want to share about what I've done. Hope it's alright if I can pause the review and pull a critical real quick. Skip here if you just want me to talk about the next album. I don't know, I don't care. So it was near the end of 8th grade, and my school was hosting its annual dance night. I believe my teachers were looking for people who wanted to sing on stage, and that's when I volunteered. Funny enough, this wasn't the first time I performed on stage at one of these events. The year prior, I sang David Bowie's Lazarus because he had passed away around that time and I wanted to find a way to pay tribute to him. I should have sung Heroes in retrospect. Anyway, so on the way home from school, I put on What I've Done, and my 12-year-old self was like, hold up, this song sounds so badass. This is perfect to perform at my school's prom. And for absolutely no reason whatsoever, I just went with it. I couldn't even find a proper instrumental to this song, so my vocals were just completely washed out by the original song itself. I had no shame performing this in a suit in front of dozens of kids and teachers, and everybody just loved it. Obviously, I don't have the guts to do something like this anymore, but back then, I just didn't care. Nobody, not even myself, felt at any point that this was one of the most inappropriate songs that you could sing at a fucking school prom. It may sound like something pulled straight out of the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books, but I swear to God, this actually happened. I didn't even know who Mike and Chester were at the time. I just thought the song sounded cool and epic. I was a very strange kid back then. Not that much has changed, but, you know. This was around the same time that I drew Rivers Cuomo kissing an anime girl, so who's to say. Anyways, Thousand Suns. When I was younger, I used to watch this channel a lot called Rocked. As you can guess, his content was mostly based around rock music. And he had this series called Regretting the Past, where he would dissect terrible rock albums track by track, and try to figure out why they were so popular. It's basically like Train Records if Todd and the Shadows only covered butt rock bands from the 2000s. And one of the albums that he covered on the series was A Thousand Suns. In this review, he says that the album is bad because Linkin Park tried to make a powerful statement that was squandered by too many interludes and weird electronic hijinks. Well, guess what, Mr. Rocked? I actually think this album is really good, and you're wrong and biased. Also, I do video essays now, so I can say whatever I want. When its lead single, The Catalyst, came out, this was it. This was the straw that broke the camel's back for so many fans. As if their shift to alt-rock wasn't already polarizing enough, the moment they decided to ditch guitars entirely for a more electronic sound was when some fans started turning their backs on this band entirely. Sorry you expected them to return to nu metal so soon, I guess. A lot of people do not like this album for some reason, and I am not one of those people. In fact, I actually think that this is their second best album behind Meteora. A Thousand Suns is genuinely fantastic. Where do I begin with this? This is easily their most complete sounding record. It's a concept album that deals with humanity's worst fears, including the idea of our world completely destroyed by nuclear warfare. How we as a society would emotionally react to it, asking ourselves if we can continue to hold on to hope in its aftermath. Will humanity still prevail and stay resilient even after our society's collapse? These are themes that I think are a lot more timely now, given the current state of countries like Palestine and Ukraine. The album even features these interludes that tie these themes together. I know a lot of listeners, Rocked included, don't like these interludes all that much, but I actually think they add a lot of cohesion to this album. My personal favorite is the one where they do a better job sampling MLK than Justin Bieber did on his last record. And if you're like me, chances are this was your first introduction to J. Robert Oppenheimer before Oppenheimer, or that epic rap Battles of History video where he went against Thanos.
A physicist like Ant-Man, all up in your stinky!
Much like how Meteora refined their hybrid theory sound, some cuts on this album refined the alt-rock sound they were trying to go for on Minutes to Midnight, all while adding just enough electronic elements to make it their own thing. Burning in the Skies is a haunting opener to this album, as it shares a bleak glimpse into a world on the brink of nuclear warfare. Waiting for the End is one of Linkin Park's most beautiful and atmospheric singles. The sound of this is almost dream pop-esque, and it's also one of the most digestible songs on the entire record. Even the more electronic cuts on this album go hard. I gotta say, Mike and the boys were cooking with this one. I love the cyberpunk vibes of Blackout, and it would go well in stuff like Ghost in the Shell or Blade Runner. I also really love Wretches and Kings and When They Come For Me, which I can only describe sonically as a fuse between Muse and 9 Inch Nails. And A Thousand Suns isn't just one of Linkin Park's darkest albums, but also one of their most uplifting. Songs like Robot Boy and Iridescent offer glimpses of hope amidst difficult times. Even if one of those songs was in a movie where the city of Chicago gets absolutely obliterated by Optimus Prime committing war crimes. The Catalyst is the album's centerpiece. It's one of my personal favorite songs from this band, don't get me wrong, but I will admit it doesn't work well without the proper context building up to this track. But other than that, this song pays off a lot of the themes from this album incredibly well. Lastly, the closing track, The Messenger, is a cute Beatles-ish acoustic end to the album, which is really just a plea to be kind to one another. Some listeners don't like Chester's vocals on this, but I personally really like it. I also really like the fact that he wrote this one for his children. So yeah, this album's great, actually. If you were expecting me to absolutely tear this thing apart, then buddy, I don't know what to tell ya. I'm trying my best here to review these records as critically as possible, so that I don't come off like some biased fanboy who will like anything this band does no matter what. With that said, I'm not exaggerating when I say that A Thousand Suns is a genuinely amazing album, and one that I think has aged well, for better or for worse. So A Thousand Suns was a huge risk taker, both for the fans and the band itself. Even if it had its defenders like myself, you can't ignore how divisive the album was on a critical standpoint. And so for their next album, Linkin Park decided to play it safe. I guess the boldest thing Linkin Park did with Living Things is that they made the world's first album where every song sounds like they were made for trailers for early 2010s action movies that would have 40% or less on Rotten Tomatoes. As a matter of fact, the closing song Powerless played a major role in the marketing for Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. Yeah, remember that movie? If I had a nickel for every time Captain America was in a movie with Mary Elizabeth Winstead, I would have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird it's happened twice. I'm gonna be honest, there isn't really much to say about this album. It's just pure ear candy, in the sense that candy is very sweet and unhealthy, and too much of it puts you in a sugar rush. Lost in the Echo, In My Remains, I'll Be Gone, and Lies, Greed, Misery are perfect to put on when you're quickscoping noobs in Call of Duty. Fun fact, Owen Pallett was responsible for the string section on I'll Be Gone. He composed the score for Her alongside Arcade Fire. It's so weird he'd even be associated with this band to begin with. That'd be like if Johnny Greenwood played on a 21 Pilots song. The alt-rock ballad, Castle of Glass, is another major highlight of mine, and Rob Borden's drumming adds so much texture to that song as well. I guess Victimized is the closest song on here that harkens back to the band's first 2 records, combined with a punk rock-like attitude, down to its quick runtime. Although I think a big issue I have with Living Things, aside from how safe it is the same issue I have with Minutes to Midnight, where the last half is significantly weaker than its first half. Until It Breaks is probably the only song on here that sounds like it's trying something a little different, which is commendable, but ultimately it just kind of boils down to being an inferior version of Nobody's Listening. And Skin to Bones is just a really bland, boring attempt at dubstep. However, I can't roast this album too much, because believe it or not, this was my first exposure to Linkin Park. Unlike most people who got into this band because of In the End or What I've Done, I got into this band because of Burn It Down. When I was in 3rd grade, my parents handed me an iPod, and on that iPod were all of the biggest hits between 2011 and 2012. It had all the songs that you'd expect to be on there: Gangnam Style, Somebody That I Used to Know, Call Me Maybe, and so on. But the funny thing about 2012 was that this is one of the last years where rock songs could still be big hits before Imagine Dragons hijacked the charts for the next few years. So when I first heard Burn It Down on my iPod, it was an out-of-body experience. I can't believe there's a rapper on this song. Anyway, the album's fine. If your favorite Linkin Park song is New Divide, then you'll like this album because a lot of songs on this album sound like New Divide clones. So after one album that explored the band's softer and more melodic side, and two albums that ventured into a more electronic direction, Linkin Park felt that it was time to go back to their roots. Just not the way you thought they would. When The Hunting Party came out, the reception was quiet. As in, nobody even knew this album was coming out. It's kind of reminiscent of when Green Day put out Warning, where they slightly changed up their signature sound, and they ended up with a mixed reception and low sales. It doesn't help the fact that this thing was barely promoted. Half the singles on here don't even have their own music videos, so you're gonna have to settle with these lyric videos instead. I honestly don't really get the hate this album gets. I actually asked on the band's subreddit if this album really was as bad as they say it is, and to my surprise, I'm not the only one who actually enjoys this album. I mean, yeah, it's a Linkin Park subreddit. Of course they would like this album. But I was surprised to see that there were so few fans who outright despised the band's new back-to-basics approach. And while it's great that the band went back to making heavier sounding music, what I admire about The Hunting Party is the approach they took to this sound. Mike Shinoda wanted The Hunting Party to sound like middle-aged adults making a loud-sounding record, as opposed to college-aged kids making a loud-sounding record, as evidenced in their first two records. What I'm trying to get here is that they wanted their return to rock music sound authentic and mature, incorporating elements of hardcore punk and heavy metal. The band insisted that this new album has no features, no trap beats, and no Swedish songwriters. Just 100% pure uncut rock. Oh wait, I take it back. There's actually a lot of features on this thing. Yes, as you can see, this is the first Linkin Park album to have features. Helmet's own Paige Hamilton has a pretty good performance on the chorus of All for Nothing. Rakim has a decent, although slightly half-baked, rap verse on Guilty All the Same. And System of a Down's Darren Malakian is, Darren Malakian on Rebellion. Really, the only feature on here I dislike is none other than Tom frickin' Morello on the instrumental piece Drawbar. Look, don't get me wrong, this man is an absolute beast when it comes to guitar solos, but his contribution here is not one of them. There's still a lot to like on this album. Keys to the Kingdom and All for Nothing give this larger-than-life 1-2 punch that sets up the album very well. Guilty All the Same is one of my favorite workout songs. The 1-minute opening solo makes me feel like I can take on the whole world. It's an interesting choice for a lead single, but I can see why it's not for everybody. Mark the Graves is a deep cut on here that sees the band getting in touch with their atmospheric side once again. War is Linkin Park going full punk rock, and Chester's voice just fits the genre so well. Honestly, he would have made a great vocalist for a hardcore punk band. And The Line in the Sand is my personal favorite closing track to any Linkin Park album. In a way, I see this song as the culmination of everything the band stood for up to this point. Mike and Chester sound like they're finally ready to face their inner demons once and for all and take back what's rightfully theirs, in what sounds like the musical equivalent to an epic kaiju battle. It's got everything. Sounds of thunder in the intro, Mike rapping, Chester screaming on the chorus. It even has an improvised guitar solo from Brad Delson. It may sound too epic for its own good, but that's probably why I love this song so much. Oh, and let's give some love to Rob Borden while we're at it. This man nearly killed himself for an album that got a 65 on Metacritic. It's even funnier considering Whiplash came out the same year. What an absolute legend. For the most part, The Hunting Party sounds so familiar, yet so different. Really, the only songs on here that somewhat resemble what you'd come to expect from this band are Wastelands, Until It's Gone, and Final Masquerade. If Transformers 4 didn't suck balls, I could see that song working for its closing credits. Because let's face it, nobody remembers that Imagine Dragons took over for this movie, and you'll probably forget again by the time this review is over. Really, the only issues I have with this album isn't the music itself, but more so the marketing. That Father of All reference I did just now wasn't a joke. The reason why this album was called The Hunting Party was simply because the band thought that rock music was dying, and they were the only ones that could bring the energy back into the genre. And according to Mike, the bands that were killing rock music were Haim, Churches, and Vampire Weekend. I mean, for one, I get what they were trying to say, And unlike Father of All, Linkin Park actually tries to stay true to their word here. But other than that, I don't think this album was gonna resurrect rock music or anything. Not to mention that the band spent years away from that genre, and making music that sounded a lot like what Churches was doing at the time. It's kind of hypocritical, and I do think these comments might have contributed to this album not doing as well as it should have. Saying that rock music is dead is an instant kiss of death, because rock is not dead. Never was. That'd be like saying that the rom-com genre is dead. No, you dummy! It's still around. It just hasn't been mainstream for years. We still get hits from time to time, though. Oh wow. I spent too long talking about this album, huh? At this point, this feels more like a defense than an actual review, so let me wrap up my thoughts real quick. This album is good. It's underrated. Linkin Park has no bad albums. Yes, not even that one. Let's talk about that one. When One More Light was first announced, yep, you guessed it, the fans did not like the new change in sound. Are you sensing a pattern here? I don't think there's been a worse discord between the band and its fans than Linkin Park. Apparently this band isn't allowed to make music that doesn't sound like Crawling or Faint. As much as I admire a big mainstream act like Linkin Park for always changing their sound with each new release, dear God, they're always treated like Bob Dylan going electric. And when the band went pop for this record, their relationship with the fans had pretty much reached its breaking point. People were accusing them of selling out, and it got so bad that Chester actually noticed and threatened them with the Will Smith treatment. Honestly, I get it. This album came out at a low point in mainstream rock music. Lots of bands had to sound like Imagine Dragons to stay relevant. Although some were able to put their own unique and creative spin on this trend, others just made absolute fools of themselves and never recovered. That said, I don't see how anybody could listen to the live instrumentation and personal lyrics on this record and think that this band was selling out. It comes off more like Whiplash because of how it starkly contrasts with the sound of their last record. When this album initially dropped, fans and critics simply did not like it. It had the lowest score of any Linkin Park album on Metacritic, and it got YouTube's most well-known music critics screaming like Doug Walker, because nothing on this album sounded like QWERTY. But this album is now almost 10 years old. Things have changed, and although this still stands as Linkin Park's worst album, I don't think it's as bad as they say it is. In fact, I've come around to actually liking this record. One More Light has the sound of a band realizing that anger won't solve their problems. If anything, the shiny and laid-back pop sound of this album only reveals just how some of these songs are outright depressing. This is easily the band's most personal album yet. The lead single, Heavy, deals with mental health, with Chester and guest vocalist Kiara offering different vignettes on their battles with their inner demons. They have a really strong vocal chemistry on this track, and there's a certain theatrical quality to it once Rob Borden's drumming kicks in. Invisible and Sorry for Now see Mike Shinoda open up about his fears of being an overbearing parent to his children, and the 90s throwback, Talking to Myself, focuses on Chester's relationship with his wife Talinda. According to Mike, this album was designed to evoke what you'd feel listening to songs from The Cure or Tears for Fears. But to me, it kind of reminds me of Love Live Seiyu's solo material. Music that sounds laid back and relaxing. Stuff you could listen to on long car rides, juxtaposed with vocal performances that make them sound cinematic and larger than life. Not sure if I have described their music properly, but hopefully you get what I mean. Songs like Nobody Can Save Me, Battle Symphony, and Halfway Right fit these qualities very well. Really the biggest strength of One More Light is Chester's vocals. You can tell how personal these songs are to him, almost as if this is his album, with his own stories to tell. And it hits harder now in the wake of his untimely passing, with the title track standing out in particular as not only the album's centerpiece, but also a heavier song than any of the heavy-sounding stuff they've built their entire career on. On here, Chester deals with the loss of a loved one, accompanied by this minimalist electronic soundscape reminiscent of Brian Eno or Aphex Twin. It was already difficult to listen to upon release, but the events that have unfolded since then have transformed this into a heart-wrenching swan song, on the same level as Mac Miller's Good News or Johnny Cash's cover of Hurt. The album's closer, Sharp Edges, serves as a light palate cleanser, with Chester looking back on his mother's advice and staying resilient through life's biggest hardships. It's really hard to talk about this record now, considering how personal it is to the band. Really, the only song that I have serious gripes with is Good Goodbye. I love how upbeat that song is, and it's not even in an epic moody way like Iridescent was. It's just a straight up happy song. But Lord, it really sounds like bland and generic NBA montage music. And Stormzy's verse on here, man. He's a very talented rapper, don't get me wrong, but he brings the same energy to this song the same way Kendrick Lamar did for Taylor Swift and Maroon 5. Make that out of what you will. Overall, One More Light is decent. It's one of the better Rock Bands Gone Pop records to come out at the height of that fad, with its breezy sound and contemplative themes. The album sounds exactly like its cover art, with the children running on the shores and towards the light. It's rather unfortunate, though, that the band's last project with Chester was savagely roasted by just about everybody at the time of its release. It's impossible to talk about Linkin Park this much anymore without mentioning the tragic suicide of Chester Bennington on the morning of July 20th, 2017. Consequently, public response to One More Light drastically changed, with some calling it the band's unintended parting gift for the fans, others calling it a cry for help that everybody chose to ignore. Regardless of your thoughts on the album, there was no doubt that Chester's passing shocked the entire music industry and left a void that could never be filled or replaced by somebody else. After a tribute concert near the end of that year, Linkin Park went on a long hiatus. Mike Shinoda would go on to focus on his solo career, putting out an album in 2018 that largely dealt with the loss of his brother in arms. I know I said I wasn't going to cover solo records for this review gauntlet, but Post Traumatic is genuinely amazing. It's remarkable how Mike could put out an entire album so quickly after Chester's death. Goes to show how much he loved him, as well as just how painful his death was to millions of people around the world. For a while, it seemed like Linkin Park's comeback was unlikely. It seemed like they'd become one of those legacy acts that would only put out unreleased material for the rest of time. Yet somehow, they managed to pull it off. But just like any of the band's post-Meteora eras, it did not start out pretty. In early September 2024, Linkin Park announced their comeback just completely out of nowhere. And this wasn't like Oasis or My Chemical Romance, where they just reunited for world tours and nothing else. No, Linkin Park went all out on their reunion. They had a concert that was also being live streamed on YouTube. They suddenly put out a new song, complete with a new music video. They suddenly announced a new album full of brand new original material. And to top it all off, they returned with not one, but two new members. And these new kids on the block were drummer Colin Britton, since Rob Borden wanted out, and co-vocalist Emily Armstrong. And people did not know how to feel about any of this. Some were happy Mike and friends were able to find a new co-vocalist, let alone bring the band back together. Others felt like they should have just pulled a new order and started a new band without Chester. Regardless of your thoughts on this sudden reunion, there was no doubt that Linkin Park's comeback sans Chester was always going to be controversial no matter what. It's like I and many others have said, that Chester's loss has left a void that will never be filled by anyone else, even if they can scream just as well as he does. It's astounding how this band finds new ways to polarize its fan base, even in 2024. But perhaps the biggest controversy to arise from their comeback was their new co-vocalist being a woman. Oh great, Linkin Park is woke now. I'm gonna go listen to real rock musicians instead. Like Kid Rock and Roddy I'm just kidding. Emily's pretty good. Although it's impossible for her to replace Chester, she still fits the band's vibe very well. You can tell that Mike really enjoys playing music alongside her, and she adds a lot of fresh energy when it comes to covering their older hits. Her stuff with Dead Sarah is also fantastic, by the way, check it out. As for the album proper, it's alright. It's a back-to-basics Linkin Park experience. If you're a fan of any of the band's past eras, then you'll find something to like about this album. And if you're a new fan of this band, then it's also pretty good as a sampler of all of the sounds they've tapped into thus far. What I'm trying to get around here is, From Zero is kind of like a greatest hits record. Musically, it combines elements from just about every era of this band since their formation. It's also another album titled after one of the band's former monikers.
It's given me a lot to think about, in particular when you talk about like the idea of feeling like you can go back to the beginning, and I think the album title reflects that very cleverly, you know, because any real Linkin Park fan knows that you're originally called Zero with an X, which is pretty sick, by the way. I mean, in terms of like discarded band names, it's kind of up there. You know what I mean? There's been a lot worse.
In a way, it's more of a reintroduction than a reinvention. Hence why it sounds less ambitious than any of their records post-Meteora, and why it clocks in as their shortest record to date. There's also not much else to say here, honestly. When the band isn't hitting you with Marvel-style doses of nostalgia with Heavy as the Crown or Two-Faced, you get some pretty cool and unique moments like on Casualty, where Mike and Emily are just aggressively yelling out the lyrics the whole time, over each other, where Emily gets to show off her prowess as a singer, or I Gave You Everything I Have, where she gets to show off her prowess as a screamer. It's so funny to me how the lead single off of this thing, The Emptiness Machine, dominated charts and racked up tons of listens on Spotify, and yet is so weak compared to almost everything else on this album. Speaking of weak, Good Things Go almost causes the album to fall flat on its face, with a snooze fest where Mike and Emily sing rejected 21 Pilots lyrics. There's a riff on here that's pulled straight out of an old Cure record, which is maybe the most interesting part of that whole song. As I was listening to this song for this review, I also noticed that one of Mike's flows on this sounds, oddly familiar. I could have sworn I heard that flow somewhere before, and then it hit me in the worst way possible. Mike interpolated a Kanye song in 2024.
First it go viral, then it get digital, then it get critical. No, I'm not doing no interview. Mask on my face, you can't see what I'm finna do. Had to move away from people that's miserable. Don't get too intimate, don't get too curious. This is just feeling like it's not that serious. Stare at the ceiling, feeling delirious. Fuck all your empathy, I want your fury, cause I was just...
Let's just end this video. Linkin Park is a band that I will cherish with all my life. They're a band that was able to break out of the nu metal mold and establish themselves as a rock band that continues to evolve their sound over time. They're always doing what they want to do, even if fans constantly beg them to go back to their old nu metal days. This band's had a lot of hiccups along the way, but they're always putting unique spins on these sounds that none of their contemporaries could ever replicate, especially Limp Bizkit. Are these Grammy-worthy records that are influential to rock and music in general? Not exactly. And a lot of this band's lyrics aren't Edgar Allan Poe, and somehow I'm okay with that. Linkin Park makes music that's both fun to listen to and easy to relate to, and I think that's why this band is as popular as they are. They're more into vibes over anything else. And considering their impact on pop culture over the years, they sure as hell have become a vibe themselves. They tried so hard and got so far, and in the end, all of it mattered. I feel like I'm forgetting something. I don't know what it is, but I feel like it might have something to do with the band's new singer.
Ani